Thank you very much indeed, Angela, for that very generous introduction. I'm just testing out the gadgets and seeing what I can break before we get started. So yes, I'm going to talk about Hammershøi, Life of Interiors, which perhaps is not the ideal subject for today, but there we go. So we're going to escape from the sunshine and into the gloom of, but very beautiful gloom of Danish interiors at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the focus is a rather extraordinary painter called Vilhelm Hammershøi. And what I'm going to do this morning is take you through a few bits about his career and his development and where he comes from. But I do want to emphasize in this talk that he is an artist who, although his world is an interior one, a very private one, he's actually an artist who is connected with the most recent developments in the European art world, widely traveled, and also that he is responding to European art tradition, including the tradition of his own country. So it's that sort of connectedness of Hammershøi's work that I want to emphasize, particularly in the second half of this session. But first of all, a bit about Hammershøi's background and his character as an artist. And I think the first thing to say, and maybe it comes through from this photograph, is that Hammershøi was a very private artist. He was quite a quiet individual. He was somebody who didn't talk very much about his own work. So he's not somebody you can go to for lots of fantastic quotes about what they're trying to achieve, as you can with, say, Gauguin or Degas. You can read up about what they've said. Hammershøi was quite private. He only gave a few interviews during his career in which he said something of what he was trying to do. But otherwise, we're very much reliant on the work itself, which is perhaps no bad thing. Just as a reminder to me, as well as to a pointer for you, his dates. So he's born in 1864, lives until 1916. Really, he comes into his maturity in the late 1880s, which I'm going to look at in a minute. And then the primary sort of focus of his career is the end of the 80s until the sort of around 1910. That's the period at which he is most active. And he is growing up actually in a very vibrant artistic society, a very vibrant community in general. And I've just got a sort of combi slide here to illustrate some of the facets of Copenhagen and its art world at the end of the 19th century. First of all, very important for any artistic world at this point, it has a prestigious and quite powerful art academy, which had been founded in the mid-18th century and which actually was still going strong at the end of the 19th century, teaching young artists. So this is the image I'm showing you on the left-hand side here, where you're looking at the School of Drawing in the Academy, where generations of young men at this stage would have been taught to draw plaster cast from the antique, but also, as here, from the life model. This is from quite early on in the 19th century, but the same scenario, I think, pretty much pertains later on in the 19th century as well. And this is this kind of discipline in drawing, which is the foundation for the artists at this point, whether they be Picasso, Hammershøi, you name it. This is the beginning for the vast majority of painters in the 19th century. So that traditional training is something that Hammershøi undergoes from the late 70s onwards into the mid-1880s. This is where he's studying. He could expect, when he finished his training in the 1880s, a fair range of patrons within Denmark itself, and particularly in the city of Copenhagen. The city was quite a vibrant capital at this point, which is why I'm showing you this image at the top here. showing the main shopping street in Copenhagen as it was in the 1890s and pretty much as it still is today if you visit Copenhagen. And we're looking at there's a celebration going on, the anniversary of the King and Queen of Denmark in the early 1890s. That's why we've got all the flags on show. But essentially this is showing you a very sort of bustling centre. Plenty of people with money, people with an interest in art going to the exhibitions, and potential patrons for Hammershøi's work. And that aspect of this world I'm illustrating on the right-hand side here in a painting by Krøyer. I'm sorry, it always gets in the way, these little widgets always sort of get places you don't want them to be. So I'm just going to move that out of the way so you can see that. So this is an evening at Neues Carlsberg. This is the beginnings of a gallery which had actually been set up by one of Copenhagen's leading art collectors at this point. This is a man called Carlsberg, who was, I think, well known for producing beer, manufacture of beer, and he made a fair amount of money from that. And he was investing money in art. He was a major supporter of the arts, including, and the painter here is a very famous Danish artist called Peder Severin Krøyer. He's one of Carlsberg's favorite artists. And you're seeing the sort of the great and the good of Copenhagen in the 1880s, enjoying a party in Carlsberg's gallery. I think this is a gentleman himself, attended by other gentlemen of the time, and then the ladies, and then some of the sculptures in his collection. And of course, the legacy, sorry about that, the legacy of this is extraordinary, because now when you go to Copenhagen, you can visit the Neues Carlsberg, the Glyptotek. It's one of the major galleries in Copenhagen. It's fantastic. You can see its wonderful collection of sculpture and painting from the late 19th century. So this is just one major collector. Another gentleman, Heinrich Hirschsprung, made his money from tobacco. And he also was a major collector. And again, the legacy in a gallery, the Hirschsprung Gallery, which again, you can visit if you go to Copenhagen to get today. So this is the world that Hammershøi is growing up in. And there's a fairly substantial, tradition, which I want to look at in a minute. But first of all, just a bit of the geography of the place, because I do always like to know, where we are, what we're looking at. This street, Stroget, is in this area of Copenhagen. So it's bang in the center, the commercial heart of the city there, that red dot marks the spot, just about where we are here. And I think one of the points to be made about Hammershøi is that although he depends on this vibrant world, he actually doesn't want to live in it. And Hammershøi, who is a quiet individual, we're going to see, wants to inhabit a very different part of the city, one that is removed from all the hustle and bustle, and is in this part of the city over here. So he's going to live, first of all, at the turn of the 80s and 90s in the sort of western suburb of the city. But then for the important phase of his career, which we're going to be concentrating on, he's living in this sort of 17th century enclave of the city. And this is where he's going to produce all of those wonderful interiors, which we know him for. So that's giving you a sense of place, I hope. The other point to be made about Copenhagen as an art centre is that it goes back, it's well established by the end of the 19th century. This is a city which has had its golden age in the sort of early to mid 19th century. It really was an extraordinarily rich art world, led by individuals like Eckersberg. I'm showing you on the left-hand side a double portrait of two daughters of one of his wealthy patrons from the early part of the 19th century, Mr. Nattenson's elder daughters. And then Eckersberg in turn is going to give rise to a whole school of artists who follow in his footsteps and concentrate, as he had done, on domestic genre subjects, either portraits of recognizable individuals or general genre scenes of family life in interior settings. And so this type of painting, when you're looking at these very careful delineations of bourgeois interiors, as we have both in the Bents and in the Eckersberg on the left, form a sort of backdrop to Hammershøi's work at the end of the 19th century. And I think particular things to notice about these early 19th century painters is their interest in space and the careful delineation of figures shown, not talking to each other or involved in some kind of little anecdote, but simply set very carefully within a three-dimensional space. Their figures sometimes treated almost as part of the geometry of these interiors. And you notice the way the elbows of this young girl here almost seem to be set in a way which echoes the shapes of that desk and then the paneling of the walls. So it's a particular way of thinking and planning picture making, which informs Hammershøi's work at the end of the 19th century. And I'll come back to that later on. So, and the detail here, because the other thing I wanted to pick out about these pictures is the refinement of technique, which is very much a part of Eckersberg's work, but then also is fed through because Eckersberg teaches at Copenhagen's Academy. So that insistence on refinement of technique, on clarity of drawing, remains as part of that sort of Danish school of painting going forward into the 19th century. And sometimes you can associate Hammershøi, particularly in the early stages of his career, when he's still training, with those earlier examples. So this in the center, I'm showing you a drawing by Hammershøi of a plaster cast, probably from an antique sculpture. And it's the type of exercise in training that, as I say, generations would have been following before him. So he would have known the work of Købke, one of Eckersberg's students from the early 19th century, who had also gone through exactly the same process of learning to draw from the antique, learning how to model a figure in three dimensions, how to locate that figure or object in space, and the very delicate modeling of the figure, again, I think can be associated with the kind of exercise that Eckersberg was conducting in the mid-19th century, but 1830s here, of a young woman by a mirror. And notice the softness of the modeling of that back here around the spine. Notice elements like the turn of the head, very finely observed, and the curvature of the body and of the arm, just treatment of the draperies in this very sculptural way, is, I think, important as looking at Hammershøi's background in painting. So this is the, if you like, the context. This is the world that Hammershøi develops within. And he was recognized quite early on as a very skillful young artist. One of his teachers, who's in fact Krøyer, said of him, I've got a very talented young man in my studio. He's quite individual in his way of working, his way of looking, but I don't want to try and make him conform too much to my teaching, because there is an individual quality there and I want to allow him to develop in his own way. The problem with that is that Hammershøi, particularly early on in his career, ran up against certain preconceptions about the way that an artist should work, about the way they should draw, the delineation of figures, the treatment of color, the treatment of line. And in a few of Hammershøi's early works, which he presented at the Academy to be shown, we see public response quite negative from the academicians, but also from contemporary critics. So this is actually a critic referring to this picture of Hammershøi's sister, which Hammershøi exhibited in 1885. And the critic here is noting that the colours are washed out. Maybe this is the natural inclination of the artist, but it leaves us with the impression that the entire scene has been shrouded in a foggy veil intentionally, and that the effect is calculated, and such calculation towards the modern is not a fortunate trait in a debutante. So there's, if you were going to listen to your critics, Hammershøi might have changed direction at this point and maybe worked in a rather different way, but he doesn't. He does continue along his independent path, and over the next couple of years produces a series of pictures of his sister, also his mother, in their apartment in that western suburb of Copenhagen, which continue the theme of monochromy, of subdued coloring, of the emphasis on atmospheric effect, rather than the delineation of objects with clarity, definition. And consistently over the next couple of years, he comes in for with a negative response from his contemporaries. So this picture on the right-hand side is actually rejected by the Academy, the scene of a bedroom. And we will look at this picture, and it's a remarkably beautiful and atmospheric image, but it didn't fit contemporary criteria for a well-finished work. And furthermore, it was felt to be somewhat risque, believe it or not, because it showed Hammershøi's sister in a bedroom, which is a private domestic space, the most private space. And this was seen to be just not fitting. So the work was rejected by the Academy. So in effect, what happens to Hammershøi is that he becomes, not because he wants to be challenging contemporary norms, he's not deliberately setting out to be avant-garde, but in practice what happens is that he becomes affiliated with artists at the end of the 19th century who are challenging established norms. He becomes part of the modern movement, in effect, which is really starting to develop some momentum in Copenhagen by the end of the 19th century. And I suppose the point that I can illustrate this point by comparing Hammershøi's work with that by some contemporaries at the time who are working on exactly the same material of figures in interiors, but in a way that is luminous, which is clear, which is evocative of pleasure, the delight in the sort of physical world of sunshine and warmth, and also which is legible in a way that Hammershøi's work is not, because in the end, Hammershøi's paintings are quite mysterious. He never, ever provides us with an explanation for exactly what his figures are doing, why they are there, why they are looking out of a window. They're simply there, meditating in their own little worlds and inviting us to join up them in that spirit. Whereas if we look at, say, Lauritz Andersen Ring from the same period, 1898, or even more, Carl Herzo, again, a very successful artist at the end of the 19th century, we're given more context, we're given a framework. We can imagine walking out into that garden, we've got a space beyond, we've got the flowers on the table, we can understand this domestic interior and the relationship between the young woman here in her reflections and the other domestic objects around her. And similarly with Ring, we can see this young woman sitting on a chair, she's reading a newspaper, it's at breakfast. There's an obvious sort of framework, if you like, a little story almost that we construct and understand the sort of lifestyle that she enjoys. And this enables people to comprehend and accept these pictures, left and right, in a way that they can't with Hammershøi. It's almost like a sort of block that he's creating, quite, I think, deliberately. So Hammershøi becomes associated with effectively the world of innovation in Danish painting, which is just starting to get a grip in the Copenhagen art scene. And I suppose one of the things that you could say about cities, European cities, by the end of the 19th century, is that any city worth its salt as a cultural center has its own avant-garde. And you can say the same with Prague in this period, obviously Vienna, Petersburg, wherever you go, London, Barcelona, these major cultural centers are all developing a wing of the art world that sets itself apart from the establishment, usually it's the academy. And Copenhagen is doing just that. So 1891, you see the foundation of the free exhibition, which is now in an area outside Copenhagen, near an airport, but in the when it was established in the 1890s, was bang in the center of the city. And this was a grouping of generally younger artists who wanted to have a forum where the more innovative artists of the city could present their work to the public. And actually, it proved to be very successful. So it still remains quite a vibrant institution. And Hammershøi is going to exhibit many of his pictures there and to win many of his patrons within Copenhagen from the free exhibition. So that's his, if you like, his situation in the art world as we go into the 1890s. And he's going to find his patrons. One of his first patrons was a dentist in Copenhagen, but he's going to push beyond that as well and become part of the international exhibition world. So 1891, also an important date for Hammershøi, is that he gets married to this young woman, Ida Ilsted, who's sitting on the left-hand side here, sewing or knitting with Hammershøi's mother. And this is something, again, you notice about Danish art, 19th century. The women are very often knitting. And I once made a comment about this to a group of students, one of whom was Danish. And I said, look, why are they always knitting in these pictures? And the student said, well, we did knit. And she'd gone to school in the 20th century, about 1960s. And she said, it was very normal. We knitted during classes at school. So it seemed absolutely normal to see this going on in all of these genre paintings. Knitting happens a lot. So he's showing his young wife, and she is going to become one of the central features of his painting. He's going to depict her again and again and again, as we will see. So marriage 1891. Originally, they're living in an apartment in that western suburb of Copenhagen, but end of the 1890s, they move to this 17th century enclave away from the main hub. So Christianshavn, you see on the right-hand side, and this is the location, this red dot, of their apartment building, which actually was a very old, I think it was a 17th century building, Strandgade 30, where they had an apartment for the next 10 years after 1898. And this is where many of Hammershøi's best-known works would be produced. In their first floor apartment, so these windows up here, and I'm showing you the courtyard of this building through these doors here. We're looking back towards those doors. Here is Hammershøi in the courtyard, lots of snow, and here is his wife, Ida, in the window. They're looking rather like something out of a ghost film. It's a little bit disturbing. So this is where they're living, and their apartment wrapped itself around this central courtyard, as we're going to see. Point to be made about Christianshavn is it's very quiet, and it was known for being quiet, and I think this is obviously what drew Hammershøi to it. So it was removed from that sort of hubbub of the main city. And this is where Hammershøi is going to embark on a whole sequence of paintings in which he shows this apartment from different perspectives, where we get different glimpses of the world that this couple inhabit. Although what is interesting is that we don't actually see much of their lives. It's a very pared down vision of that world. A plan of their apartment. This was in one of the catalogues of, I think might have been the exhibition of Hammershøi's art in London some years ago, provided this very useful plan of the apartment. There's the courtyard there, that open space. The main gates to the building would be here. And this is on the first floor, and you've got the drawing room, dining room, and so on. You get a sense of all these doors opening out into the different rooms. And of course, I've always wanted to sort of work out exactly where we are, because I'm like that when we're looking at any one of these pictures. So I reckon that what we're seeing here, I hope I don't get this wrong, is locating this by the boiler pipe that you can see there. There is the boiler there. So I reckon, and that doorway is this one here, I reckon we're standing just about there, and we're looking through this sequence of doorways towards the windows opening out on the courtyard there. Wonderfully complex space, and it's divine because it's both very complex, but it's also incredibly simple. The grey walls, the white doors, the brownish floor, that's it. Just offset by the gilded door handles. Very, very simple, but also wonderfully intricate. And then in this painting on the right, I think we're in the drawing room, and I'm not sure which viewpoint we have, but it may be that we're looking towards this wall here with the piano and Hammershøi's wife, oil lamp, few pictures on the wall. And again, this is wonderful restraint always in Hammershøi's work, that there's the play of very simple shapes. There's the paring down of color to the sort of barest essentials. Notice the way that the overall tonality, the gray and the white, but that's being offset by the warmish color of the piano itself, but then highlighted the whole thing singing, because he includes this butter in a dish in the foreground, which you then pick up, as it were, reflected and modified in the gilded frames of these pictures. And this is the sort of essence of Hammershøi's work, that he extracts from the world he inhabits to show us just what he wants and no more. And sometimes photographs, because Hammershøi doesn't talk very much about this, but sometimes photographs give you a sense of what he's doing. So this is a photograph of Hammershøi and his wife sitting on a couch in that drawing room. And there's the piano beyond that Ilse is sitting at here. And but one thing you notice, and there's the oil lamp appears, there's the oil lamp that you can see in the painting. And you've got a couple of pictures there, which may be the pictures that we've got here. You've got the paneling, you can notice that he's included. But what we never see in Hammershøi's work are the older and more elaborate furnishings that he had in his apartment. I mean, we think about Hammershøi's pictures and we imagine him to be Spartan and absolutely, almost a modernist in making, and that seems to have excluded from his home anything that might be fussy or frilly or anything of that antique nature. But Hammershøi loved buying antiques. And one of the things he said in one of his letters is, I'm in Amsterdam or whatever it was, and I'm having great fun going to all the old antique markets. And he loved buying. He loved Biedermeier furniture from the early 19th century. And you see examples of that in this painting here, the table. But he excludes those from his paintings. And notice that lamp with the frills, that doesn't appear in the paintings. So in other words, he extracts from these interiors exactly what he wants and no more. I can illustrate what Hammershøi is maybe trying to get at, what the sort of backbone, what the skeleton of his painting is. maybe by picking out a single example. And I think it's one of the most beautiful of Hammershøi's works, this interior with a young woman seen from behind, now 1904. Very, very pared down. She's carrying maybe a pewter dish in her hands. A single elaborate object is this china bowl. Somebody will be able to identify exactly what this object is, but he loved buying china, so occasionally we see it, but that's it, and it's there because the whites and the blues in that object play off the greys and the whites of the paneling, and they just provide a bit of elaboration, a detail, to offset the austerity of the picture as a whole. Notice we don't see any details of the painting in the top left. All we see are the forms, the shapes, the geometries of those pictures. And this is one of those occasions where Hammershøi does have a statement. He does express his what it is that he's trying to achieve in these pictures. This is an interview he gives in 1907. What makes me choose a motif is as much the lines in it as and what I would call the architectural stance in the picture. And then the light, of course. It is naturally also very important, but the lines are always what I'm most taken by. Colour is of secondary importance. I suppose I'm not indifferent to how it looks in colour. I work very hard to make it harmonious, but when I choose a motif, I think mainly in lines, and yes, the beauty of the colour, but fundamental to Hammershøi's perception of his world and his planning of a picture is establishing the primary lines, the framework. So, and I've done a bit of my drawing here just to illustrate that, and some of these lines are more emphasized than others. So, for example, this hint at paneling below the desk is really quite sublime. It's quite limited, but it's there nonetheless, and it picks up the verticals of the upper part of the painting. The overall pyramidal organization of the composition, which helps to give it its balance. Also there, thinking in lines, and there's the conjunction of these diagonals with the main elements of the picture. So the top of that china bowl there, and one of the lower right-hand corner. What else have we got? Curves, the curving line of the body. I think primary here is this wonderful curve that Hammershøi establishes with his wife, seen from the back, flowing through the body, down the curvature of the head, along the neck, and then the curve of the torso down to the skirt here. And that's offset by other curves that you see in the china bowl and the arms, that pewter dish as well. So that is what makes Hammershøi's pictures almost like visual music. It's this play of lines within the paintings that is so important. I want to look now at where these ideas come from. What is the backdrop to Hammershøi's perception and why he chooses to depict interiors in the way that he does. And I've said, quite a few times that he's a very private person. He lives a very quiet, almost fairly reclusive life from day to day. But at the same time, he is very interested in art abroad and the art tradition. And one of the things he does throughout his maturity, this is from the mid-1880s onwards, is he makes regular trips abroad. One of the places he likes to come actually is London. He's one of those people who actually liked London weather, because all of those fogs and the rain, it suited his aesthetic quite well. So London was a place he came to quite a lot. But he's certainly from the mid-1880s going to abroad, and he's starting to travel at just about the point that Vermeer is becoming a celebrity. I mean, we've had the exhibition in Amsterdam, and this was at The Hague, I can't remember, the Rijksmuseum, big exhibition. And we know Vermeer is one of the most famous artists in the world. But for much of the 19th century, Vermeer had been forgotten. And it's only from the 1870s that people are starting to look at Vermeer. That there's, if you like, there's something in Vermeer that they recognize as fitting their own aesthetic ideas. So Hammershøi is looking closely at Vermeer from 1885, when he first visits Amsterdam. He's then going to go to Germany. He'll see a work by Vermeer in Dresden. And there is definitely an association between the way that Vermeer plans his pictures, the design of objects and figures in space, the soft modeling of figures and shadows, the restrained coloring in many of Vermeer's pictures that really speaks to Hammershøi's aesthetic. And sometimes Hammershøi will even pick up on an exact motif painted in Vermeer, woman by a window or woman reading a letter, as in this case. He's, and just a close-up of that, I hope you can get that sense, the wonderful smokiness of Vermeer's painting of the figure, and the evocative atmosphere that he creates as a result partly of that indistinctness in his style is something that is very appealing to Hammershøi. So Vermeer, important. Motifs I've mentioned, motifs like women at the window. He would have been looking again through his travels in Germany, also the collections in Copenhagen, the Royal Collection. There were a number of 17th century Dutch painters. So he's looking at this tradition in interior picture making, and motifs like women at the window with the light coming through from the outside and infusing the whole sort of interior with a glowing light. Let's go forward, up and back. Another example of Vrel from the mid-17th century. And then finally, the example we're inevitably going to think about is, what about Friedrich? And was Hammershøi looking at pictures like this, drawings and paintings by Friedrich of women looking out of the window, women seen from behind in this wonderfully mysterious way? And the answer is probably not, because, which is very frustrating, because, but it's again, it's a question about the reception of artists and what's known when. And really, Friedrich was a forgotten painter at the end of the 19th century. And it's not until 1906, there's a big exhibition of Friedrich's work in Berlin, that Friedrich, suddenly people start to take notice of Friedrich, and works like this one, Woman at a Window, start entering public collections. So this picture actually is bought by the Berlin National Gallery in 1906. So too late, in other words, for a picture like this one of 1890. So, but that's an interesting one. And of course, if it turns out, I haven't come across this, but it turns out that there were photographs of Friedrich's work that Hammershøi did know about, even before Friedrich is a celebrity, then that would be very interesting indeed, because there does seem to be a fit there. Spaces, the complexity of spaces in Hammershøi's work, I think also worth thinking about in terms of that Dutch tradition in painting from the 17th century. So this example by Emmanuel de Witt, interior with a woman at the virginal, is a picture that Hammershøi very well might have seen. And I think it's worth mentioning it in terms of the differences between the complexity of de Witt's painting with its color and the intricacy of those shadows and the objects in this painting, that Hammershøi, as well as traveling abroad and looking at these pictures in person, was also quite a collector of art books. So at his death, there were a number of art history books with black and white photographs in them of his favorite paintings. So, and I think that the fact for Hammershøi of having these pictures in black and white reproduction would not necessarily have been a loss for him, because it would have been emphasizing the qualities about their art that he really liked, which was the focus on space and light and shadow and the arrangement of those essential elements of an interior that he wants to draw out in his own work. So, and certainly there are examples from the Danish tradition that Hammershøi is very much playing up to. So this taste for paintings of the interior is well established in Denmark, as I've mentioned. And so Hammershøi would have been absolutely aware of works like this one by Bentz, of a wealthy merchant family in their fashionable Copenhagen apartment, done up in all the latest colors. That green apparently was the latest thing. So the intensity of coloring is absolutely not for Hammershøi, but the idea of recreating an interior and the illusion of light shining in from a rear window is very much something that Hammershøi would have liked. He's also responding into his contemporary art world. And he's certainly looking at people, oh dear me, I thought I'd got rid of all these typos, but no, I did not. That is not yes, it is. No, it's correct. Thank God I got it right. So that's Hammershøi on the left-hand side, a picture of his mother. And this is Whistler. Good, I did get it right. Arrangement in grey and black. A picture that Hammershøi knew very well, visiting Paris. This picture was in the National Collection in Paris. So it was it was visible and very well known to artists at the end of the 19th century. Whistler's most famous work. And here is Hammershøi literally doing a sort of riff on Whistler in this picture. And we know that Hammershøi, he admired Whistler very much, and he wanted to meet him. He actually went to Whistler's studio on one occasion so that he could talk to the great man, but Whistler was out or pretending to be out, so that didn't happen. But he certainly, this is a real tribute to the simplicity of design in Whistler and the harmony of very, very simple colors that you see in Whistler's work. More broadly, Hammershøi is aware of the artists of his own generation abroad. By the 1890s, he was exhibiting regularly on the international art scene. So his first big breakthrough was at the International Exhibition in Paris in 1889, where he actually got a medal for one of his works. But in turn, he's also looking at the work of other exhibitors like the French painter Vallotton and his painting of a young woman, possibly Vallotton's wife, in their apartment in Paris. And more broadly, at the end of the 19th century, and this is where Hammershøi really needs to be seen as an artist of his time, he's part of this wider fascination, really, with the interior life, which you can interpret in this is a very big field and is part of this desire at the upper end of the 19th century to withdraw from the contemporary world, almost a spirit of disenchantment with modernity, with its industry, its congestion, its poverty, all of the problems that beset the late 19th century urban world induce a desire to withdraw from that to a quiet interior where one can reflect, lose oneself in dreams. There are novels about this in this period, and across Europe, from Prague here to this is Vienna with Karl Moll on the right-hand side. This is Schikaneder on the left, and then to Belgium in Western Europe, the Knopf here, portrait of his sister Marguerite. All of this generation, one of their obsessions is the painting of the interior, very atmospheric, quite decorative, I think particularly with the Moll on the right-hand side. Notice the decorative lineup of those cups on that table and the stripes, again, placing those cups. It's all very geometric and perfected, but it's also, these are interiors where one is invited to dream, to reflect on one's withdrawal from anything that might be troubling. So Hammershøi, in other words, fits this taste. And I think this is, to understand why Hammershøi becomes so successful, to be aware of this wider art scene, I think is important. I'm going to finish in just a couple of minutes, but I thought I would just end with a sequence looking at some of these interiors. Again, just to begin with, relating them to an aspect of European symbolist art that one finds in the 1890s. So this is, again, a Belgian artist, Xavier Mellery, probably 1880s in this case. It's not dated, but showing just the same kind of motif that Hammershøi does in his interiors at Strandgade 30, 1905. And Hammershøi will pursue this really as an obsession in picture after picture, sometimes including the figure of his wife, sometimes not, showing recognizably the same scenes, the same placements in that interior, but with just slight variations, almost obsessive variations in the placing of the main figure, in the details, the pieces of furnishings that are included or excluded, in the treatment of the lighting, which is more or less gold or grey from picture to picture, more or less luminous. And it's, well, it's quite interesting to follow a sequence like this through, to perceive, to note the things that are being included or excluded from particular images. So those pictures there that we see have gone on the left-hand side. This is 1901, that's 1908. Instead, we have a picture on the right that he's slight variations in that chair. The design of the chair, the back, is different from one to the other. It's a very slight alteration, angles of view on the interior. And then, of course, the placement of Ilse herself within these rooms. So again, there's almost a sense of a ghostly figure from past to present. One moment she is here, another moment she is further into the far room. But as if the whole place carries the reflection of Ilse's presence moving from one site to another. And some of his the sequences of images will simply be of a single room or window within his apartment. So this is a view over that interior courtyard. You're seeing the single window shown in each of these, the sequence of images. But we've got the table tucked in there. Sometimes he's even decided to remove the door handle, quite a spooky omission on this image on the right-hand side. So there's a fascination on seeing the possibilities of a single, very, very simple thing in an apartment that he's looking at every day. But it is, in the end, it's the lines, it's the design, but also the variations of the lighting that are if you like, the subject of the painting. And you don't need to worry about the story. It's the atmosphere of place that is what matters. Just to finish up, by this point in Hammershøi's career, I've mentioned that he was exhibiting regularly. And by the early 20th century, he was recognized as being perhaps Denmark's leading artist. Now, there's some bit of a question about that, but there are claims made that Hammershøi was the single most celebrated Danish artist at the start of the 20th century. And this is actually a comment by a Danish critic of the time, saying that as Danes, we understand perhaps better than most others the human qualities that express themselves through colour. And indeed, behind Hammershøi's colours, we sense an infinitely cautious person, a quiet, sad dreamer, the weirdest soul ever to grace Danish painting. And this is picked up. And there are commentators abroad, French critics particularly, are writing admiring reviews of Hammershøi's work. And I think when you look at a picture like this one, again, the subtlety of it, it seems very, very ordinary, maybe at first glance, but start to notice elements like that intense shadow along the ground there, which makes the door almost seem to float in space, creates a void almost under that door, which is echoed in the darkness of this shadow above the door, creates the sense of mystery and imminence. The treatment of those window panes, where sometimes we have logic, we have the everyday of tiles on a roof and the building opposite in the street. But in other parts of the window, these other window panes, we have either obscurity or just blankness. And then finally, and most wonderfully of all, perhaps, it's this evocation of light, the light beams shining through dust in this room, and that sense of stillness that one gets when one notices that, the beauty of that image. Very, very subtle, but extraordinarily fine. So that is my introduction to Hammershøi's work, and I wanted to see if anybody has any questions.